Church. Awesome to be here and be able to share the Word of God with you this afternoon. As you can see, we are in this short series called Into the Unknown. For the past 2 Sundays, Dave shared with us a little bit about the calling of God to Abraham and how Abraham responded to this calling. God called Abraham from the idolatrous and pagan context of Ur of the Chaldeans in order to make him a blessing to the whole world. And everybody linked or connected to Abraham would share in those blessings. Abraham would become a conduit, a channel of God's blessings. In the overall context and scheme of Scriptures, indeed, Abraham plays an interesting role. He stands as an intermediary of the source of life that comes from God. He's also in the line of access to God and divine mercy. God was pretty clear when he told Abraham in Genesis 12:3, I will bless those who bless you, right? And I will oppose or curse those who curse you. I will curse those who oppose you, Abraham. This means that those connected to Abraham would enjoy God's favor. Those disconnected from Abraham would not have access to divine favor. Indeed, it would be by participating in this covenant between God and Abraham that sinners all around the world would receive, and even to this day receive, the greatest blessing of all into their lives, which is redemption by faith in Jesus Christ, redemption of their souls by faith in Jesus Christ, who is a descendant of Abraham. And this afternoon, I'd like to invite you to inspect the life of someone who was on the receiving end of the blessings of Abraham. He partook of Abraham's faith in Yahweh, the true living God. But different from Abraham, this individual did not live out his faith in Yahweh and the Lord. Instead, he distanced himself from the Lord. And as a result, he reaped catastrophic results and consequences. It became the source of spiritual distress for the people of God because of his spiritual compromise. So I invite you to look at the life of Lot, Abraham's nephew, to learn that believers who live distant from God become a disgrace and a hindrance to the people of God. Believers who distance themselves from God become a hindrance to the people of God. And we can divide Lot's life, and it's going to be a little bit of looking at the Bible because his life spans a few chapters. But we can divide the life of Lot, Abraham's nephew, into 3 stages, okay? And pardon, I don't have PowerPoint, but you can follow. It's pretty simple. 3 stages in the life of Lot. His ascension and stability, followed by decline and finally a crash. So ascension and stability, decline and crash. So let's observe, first of all, his ascension, followed by a brief moment of stability. This is the time that we just began to read here, that Matt read for us. When Lot is under the influence, he's immediately connected under the direct influence of his uncle Abraham. This is when Lot becomes exposed for the first time to the true living God Yahweh. So Lot appears for the first time here in Genesis 11, verse 27 to 32. We read in verse 27 that Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran fathered Lot. That's his first appearance in the Bible. Then in verse 28, we read that Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. So his father died. And then in verse 31, we learn that Terah took Abram his son and Lot, the son of Aaron, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth from Ur to Canaan. But they made a stop in Haran for a few years, and there Terah died. So when Terah dies, Lot comes under the care of Abraham pretty much. Okay, so to sum up the life of Lot up to this point, so he's Abraham's nephew, son of Haran. His father died early. Abraham and Terah leave Ur and go to Canaan. And then when Terah dies, Lot is put under the care of Abraham. And he remains under the care of Abraham for a while. Perhaps Abraham was thinking of an heir. As we know, Sarah was barren. She was not able to bear a child. So perhaps Abraham was rearing Lot to become his future heir. When Abraham finally decides to obey God in Haran and go to Canaan, Lot goes with him. So Lot is most likely a young man in Genesis 12. If you have your Bible, Genesis 12, verses 4 to 5. Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. Sometime later, there was a famine in the land of Canaan. So Abram decides to go to Egypt. And guess who goes with the family? Lot. Okay? Lot goes with Abraham. Genesis 12:10. And when they come back from Egypt, when they return to Canaan, both Abraham and Lot have a bunch of possessions. They've become even richer than they were before. Lot seems to be a grown man, rich with possessions. He has flocks, herds, and tents. He's a rich man in his own right. So he's not necessarily dependent on Abraham, at least materially, anymore. It's interesting because when we read the narrative, Lot becomes some sort of accessory or appendage to Abraham, right? So you go from 11:27 to 11:31, and then to 12:4, and then to 13:1. All the time you come across and Lot with him, and Lot with him, and Lot with him. Why does this guy keep popping up in the narrative? It was while connected to his uncle Abraham that Lot was removed from the pagan context and his pagan religion in Ur of the Chaldeans in southern Mesopotamia. It was under the care of his uncle, who is the conduit of God's blessings, that he's introduced to Yahweh for the first time. It is in the context of the conduit of God's blessing that Lot witnesses faithfulness in Abraham towards God and the faithfulness of God towards Abraham. He also witnesses the mercy of God by bringing back Abraham and Sarah from Egypt, richer than they were before, after Abraham really messed up, as you probably know, by lying and cheating. Lot had no godly heritage from his dad or from his grandfather. Everything that he was learning about the true living God was coming from Abraham. It was he had the privilege of walking alongside Abraham, his uncle. And most likely during this time he heard about and he learned about God's promises to him, as we read in Genesis 2:1-3. And Abraham did, in fact, become a blessing to Lot in so many ways. I mean, if you read the narrative forward a little bit, in Genesis 14, you learn that there is a war between kings, and Lot is kidnapped, and guess what? Abraham saves Lot. And when God is about to destroy Sodom, Abraham pleads before God to save Lot. So Abraham will earnestly fight both physically and spiritually for the welfare of Lot. So this is the first stage of Lot's life. This is the moment when he is connected to Abraham. He is walking with the channel of God's blessings. Okay? He is receiving these blessings because of God's faithfulness to Abraham. Everything is going well for Lot up to here. Now we can turn to the next page of Lot's life. Unfortunately, this second stage is marked by decline. Now it's chapter 13 of Genesis. Lot begins to flirt with sin. This is when he becomes a bad example for us. He teaches us that the believers who live distant from God become a disgrace and a hindrance to the people of God. After Lot and Abraham left Egypt, they came out with a bunch of possessions. Okay, they settle in Canaan. Abraham has a bunch of herds, tents, and animals and servants. And then you have Lot with him with a bunch of herds, a bunch of tents, and a bunch of servants, and a bunch of possessions of all sorts, material possessions. So they are settling in Canaan, and there is a dispute between the shepherds of the herds of Abraham's animals, of Abraham's herds, and the shepherds who took care of the herds of Lot. So the shepherds get into a fight. Maybe they were vying for the space, the pasture, or even for water. That was a commodity in those days in that region. So the shepherds fought over pasture, over land and water. And Abraham tells Lot, hey Lot, listen, we have this problem. So here's an idea for us to solve this. If you go east, I'll go west. If you go west, I'll go east. If you go north, I'll go south, and vice versa. Let's split up. Well, up to this point, Lot has been receiving blessings because of he's been connected with Abraham. So this is the chance that Lot has to tell his uncle Abraham, listen, Uncle Abe, I don't want to go anywhere, okay? I have been connected with you this whole time. I have been witnessing God's faithfulness and mercy and love towards you, and I have been benefiting from my relationship with you, okay? So I don't want to go anywhere. I have been blessed spiritually and materially because of my relationship with you. If needed, Uncle Abe, I will sell part of my possessions. I will choose to reduce my riches so that I can have this special relationship with you and ultimately with your God. That's Lot's chance. I want to stick by you, Uncle Abe. Well, in Genesis 13, 10, and 11, we read what Lot decides to do. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. So far we've been reading about Abraham and come across the repeated phrase, and Lot with him, and Lot with him, and Lot with him. And now we read, and Lot no longer with Abraham. Now we come to this most unfortunate sentence that breaks a most fortunate pattern. They separated from each other. And this is most unfortunate for Lot, because God's blessings have not separated from Abraham. So this means that God's blessings are now separated from Lot, because he's separated from Abraham. He has been attracted by material possessions. He's been attracted by what he can see. So he sacrifices his spiritual blessings for material ones. Lot separates from Abraham. Don't disregard this. Lot was removed, remember, from the pagan context, wicked context of Ur because of Abraham. Lot came to the knowledge of Yahweh because of Abraham. Lot amassed riches and wealth because of Abraham. God bestowed blessings, material and spiritual, over Lot because of Abraham. But now Lot separates from Abraham. And he goes back to a life under corrupt influence that will make Lot stink with spiritual compromises. And Lot's spiritual compromises takes place in 3 steps. Genesis 13, 8 through 11, we see that Lot decides to live close to Sodom. We might think that Lot's spiritual decline began with a bad decision, live close to Sodom. But his spiritual decay actually began with his disposition to make decisions based on a materialistic worldview, with no regard for the spiritual consequences that decision would bring. When he decided to go to the Jordan Valley, Lot thought he was going to pitch his tents in the land of prosperity, but he ended up in the land of immorality and spiritual mediocrity. Lot's decision to settle in the valley was motivated by greed. And he chose those things at the expense of spiritual success. And don't overlook this. He continued to enjoy material prosperity while in Sodom. But he was a spiritual failure. In material success, or prosperity without spiritual success, is failure. Material prosperity without spiritual success equals failure. Material success does not necessarily mean spiritual success. Those are 2 different things. They come separate from each other. They don't come together necessarily. Lot failed to live by faith for God. As Spurgeon said, the more of heaven there is in our lives, the less of earth we shall covet. Well, Lot had little of God in his heart and mind. So he made decisions based on earthly pleasures and allures. So what drives your decisions? Is it material comfort? Is it spiritual success? Whatever it is, just know that decisions made upon sinful motivations will take you closer to sin than you ever bargained for. And that's precisely what we are about to see in Lot's life. Lot decides to live close to Sodom. Now we come to the second step. Lot moves closer and closer to Sodom. We read in Genesis 13:12, Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley, and listen, and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So Lot gradually moves closer and closer to Sodom. And it is at this point that the Bible inserts a very interesting descriptive comment about the inhabitants of Sodom. 13:13, Genesis 13:13. The men of Sodom were evil and great sinners in the eyes of the Lord. Now, stop and think about the effect of this comment, right, in the context. Lot moved his tents as far as Sodom, and the men of Sodom were evil and great sinners before Yahweh. The Bible makes this comment because God wants us to think of Sodom on those terms, as a city populated by evil and wicked people. And the person crafting the book of Genesis is going back to Genesis 6, where we read that the people of earth, the men of earth, the son of men, were wicked before God's eyes. Hence the flood. So now the writer of Genesis wants us to expect a judgment. Okay? Lot is in the same context as we read in Genesis 6. So he's setting himself up for judgment. And Lot knew firsthand about the flood. I mean, those people back then, it's not like they lived 60 years. They were living 900 years. So we do have some overlap, okay? So Lot most likely heard firsthand from the descendants of Noah, the sons, especially Shem, what the flood was all about, okay? So the third step now, finally, we find Lot living in Sodom, okay? So first, he decides to live in Sodom. Then he moves closer and closer to Sodom. Now, his third step in this spiritual compromise, he is living in Sodom. He lives a comfortable life and becomes a citizen and probably a leader in the city. The Bible's not boring. And if you want to make sure of that, go to Genesis 14. We find a war. We find two coalitions of kings, 5 kings against 4 kings, 2 coalitions. There's a war between them. One of the kings involved in the war is the king of Sodom. Okay? And the king of Sodom loses that war. His coalition loses the war. And the winners, they come to Sodom, sack the city, take all the possessions, and they kidnap Lot. Okay? And we read in Genesis 14:12, the enemies also took Lot, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. The implication is obvious, okay? Who would kidnap a nobody? You kidnap somebody who has money to pay for ransom, and someone who is important enough that other people will mobilize themselves to rescue that person. Perhaps the citizens of Sodom, the king of Sodom, would mobilize and save Lot. And later in the narrative, in Genesis 19, we find Lot again in the city of Sodom. This time the angels are coming to execute judgment according to God's command. And we read in Genesis 19:1 that the angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. Now, this reference to the gate of Sodom, it's not like Lot was coming back from the field, worked the land, and he was tired and just leaned himself against the wall in the city gate. That's not necessarily the case. Well, the city gate was, in many cities, like a courtyard, a space where people would come and gather and discuss ideas and do business. All right? Especially in the evening. You have shade. It's cool in the day, then you have those discussions. It was also a place where magistrates or the officials of the city would come to discuss civic and legal matters. So perhaps, it's not certain, perhaps Lot was among the leaders of the city as well, because he is over there in the gate. That might be indicative of his authority and influence. But I just want you to note the progression in the life of Lot. Lot first looks down towards Sodom, okay? And then he decides to go to Sodom. And then he starts moving closer and closer to Sodom until he becomes a citizen of Sodom. Sinful motivations will slowly lead you towards sin until you find yourself living in it. And this kind of life, my brother, my sister, brings no satisfaction whatsoever for the genuine believer. In fact, Lot himself is not living the happiest life of all. If we go to 2 Peter chapter 2, we find a comment about Lot, that his soul was tormented by the depravity of the citizens of Sodom. The problem was that even though his soul was tormented, he didn't take action. That doesn't help. And the worst thing is that Lot now is causing distress to Abraham. And that's a problem, because Abraham is the conduit of God's blessing to the world. So now you're messing with God. He's bringing distress to his uncle, and he does it twice. As I mentioned before, there's that war going on. He's kidnapped. And Abraham, instead of the citizens of Sodom, Abraham rounds up an army of 318 men to go after the winning kings, those who had the victory, defeats them, bring Lot back along with the possessions. So that's material and physical distress to Abraham. Later in Genesis 18, God is revealing his plans to Abraham to destroy Sodom. And Abraham wrestles with God. He pleads with God. It's even silly when you read the narrative. Abraham is trying to narrow down to Lot's family. Oh Lord, if there are 50 people who are righteous in law, will you, oh righteous God, destroy the righteous with the unrighteous? Of course not. And he does that a few times with God. Of course he's trying to zero in Lot. And he pleads before God on behalf of Lot's life. That's spiritual distress. There's no satisfaction in sin, my brother, my sister, no matter how exhilarating you might feel at the moment. The spiritual compromises that you make will bring distress upon yourself and those around you. You will not be a blessing, period. Believers who live distant from God become a disgrace and a hindrance to the people of God. And now we come to the third stage in Lot's life, which is his crash. Genesis 19. This is when Lot is under horrible, horrible distress. This is when he reaps the consequences of his sinful compromises. We see in Genesis 19 4 things that stand out, pointing to Lot's crash. Go to Genesis 19, verses 4 to 8. First of all, his spiritual demise is marked by debased and degraded life standards. Utterly debased and degraded life standards. After Abraham pleads for Lot's life, the Lord sends 2 angels to respond positively to Abraham's prayer. And the Lord dispatches those 2 angels to tell Lot, hey, there will be a judgment. It's coming soon. So you got to leave, okay? You have to leave with your family. And Lot receives those angels in his house. It's pretty cool. He entertained angels, as we read in Hebrews 11. It's evening. We come to an interesting episode, well-known episode. It's evening. And the angels are getting ready to go to bed. Now, that's a sentence that I don't think you anticipated hearing today, right? It's evening and the angels are getting ready to go to bed. But anyway, Genesis 19, 4 to 5. Before the angels lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may have sexual relations with them." Now, this is the kind of society that Lot chose to live and to raise his family. Now, this is something that causes you to pause. But surely Lot is righteous. I mean, he will never adopt the mindset and the practices of those people. I mean, that's outrageous. He would never allow himself to be influenced by those people. Well, let's read verses 7 through 8. Lot proposes to do something to protect his guests. "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold," I wish the text stopped here, by the way, but it doesn't. "Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known man, who have not had sexual relationships with men. Let me bring them out to you and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." Again, this makes me speechless. I mean, I can't be speechless. That would be awkward, but it made me speechless. You have to take a moment to let that sink in. It's impossible to overlook Lot's sense of belonging here. He calls these men my brothers. Like we call each other brother and sister, he calls them my brothers. More than that, though, notice what he proposes to his brothers. Okay? He's so far from the truth. His mind is so corrupted. His judgment is so distorted Now he says, listen guys, now you're crossing the line over here, okay? Don't be messing with my guests. You are trying to rape my guests. Instead of that, just rape my daughters. That's okay. Now that's akin to saying, hey, listen, don't be murdering people with a machete. That's too messy. Just use a gun. This is absurd. But it's easier to understand when we realize that Lot, he's not bothered by sin. He's not concerned about sin. He's concerned about his own reputation as a good host and a decent citizen of Sodom. That's his concern. It's not sin. Lot moved to Sodom, thinking that he would make residence in Sodom, but in the end, Sodom had made residence inside Lot. He had absorbed the utterly debased and degraded life standard. Second, Lot's crash is marked by lack of godly influence over his family. We read in verse 14 of Genesis 19 that Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law who were to marry his daughters, "Get up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city." What a wonderful spiritual leader he was. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. So when it came to spiritual things, Lot was a joke in the eyes of his family. We see here Lot attempting to talk about spiritual things, to talk about the Lord. But that didn't match his life, and it was obvious. So they thought he was just joking. Is your spiritual life taken seriously by others? If you try to speak about spiritual things with your family, with your co-workers, with your neighbors, would they think that you're joking? The truth is, if you are truly living close to God, people will expect you to talk about spiritual things. So Lot's crash is marked by utterly debased and degraded life standards, lack of godly influence over his family. Third, his demise is marked by love for sin in the world. In Genesis 19:15 to 16, the angels come to take Lot and his family to save them from destruction. And verse 16 says that Lot lingered. Lot lingered. They had to drag Lot out of Sodom. And his wife was no different. In verse 26, she disobeys God's command. She looks back at Sodom and she's turned into a pillar of salt. She loved her life more than obedience to the Lord. And Jesus uses her example in Luke 17 to teach precisely that, about love for your own life. Lot's crash is marked by utterly debased and degraded life standards, lack of godly influence over his family, love for sin and the world, and finally, we have basically the climax of everything: sexual immorality that results in shame and long-standing distress. Lot's life, Lot's family, himself, they all became so absorbed with that life in Sodom. They became so attached to that wicked city that we find here in Genesis 19 the final episode involving Lot, tainted with shocking, disturbing, disgusting, and repugnant sexual immorality. His two daughters give him wine, make him drunk, sleep with their father to preserve his offspring. So we read in 1936 to 38 that both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son and called him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Again, that's at least the third episode in Lot's life that will make you pause. And the tragedy here, besides all that we have just described and related, is that the two sons that are born, they become the patriarchs of two nations, two groups, the Ammonites and the Moabites, who were enemies of the descendants of Abraham. So the incestuous relationship caused centuries-long distress to the people of God. Lot's life caused that. Lot's decisions caused that. So Lot decided to live far from God, so he became a disgrace and a hindrance to the people of God. His life stands in sharp contrast with the life of Abraham. This is perhaps one of the first few episodes after God called Abraham that show how faithful God will be and is to Abraham. Those who bless Abraham, those who are close to Abraham, those who participate in that covenant that God has with Abraham will be blessed. And those who distance themselves from that will not. That's what God said, and it's coming to pass already. Lot became an example of believers who seek after material prosperity and at the same time sacrifice spiritual blessing. Let me just mention 5 concluding thoughts so we can wrap this up. First, don't we ever underestimate your sinful nature. Sodom is closer than you think. Sodom is closer than you think. It's in your pocket. It's in your living room. It's across the fence. It's in the next cubicle. It's in your office. It's in your head. Second, don't underestimate God's mercy. It is too great for us to fully comprehend. Lot, he was dragged out of Sodom. And brothers and sisters, I am not fully aware, but I am sure that God drags me each and every day out of Sodom so that I will not destroy myself. He drags me out of contexts that I placed myself, and by His mercy He drags me out and He saves me. He did that ultimately on the cross, but He does it each and every day. Because unfortunately we go back to those places. We're not supposed to. But we are prone to wander, as the hymn writer says. Prone to wander. Don't underestimate God's mercy. Don't be deceived either. It doesn't matter. Listen, it doesn't matter how much your soul is tormented by sin. That's worthless if you don't take any action. Lot was tormented by sin, but he didn't take action. You only show how much you hate sin when you stop living in it. Don't be fooled. People will take your spiritual life seriously only when you take your spiritual life seriously. Otherwise, you will be a joke. And finally, don't stray away. Stay connected. Close with God, lest you become a hindrance to the people of God. Pray with me. Dear Father, we come to your presence once again, humbled by your faithfulness and humbled by your mercy that each and every day saves us from our foolishness. Thank you for saving us from ultimate judgment and from the day-to-day foolish decisions that we make. We pray that you will protect each one of us here, that we will walk close to you so that we may be a blessing, a conduit, a channel of blessing to those around us. In Christ's name.